Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Regional Economic Conditions webinar on business conditions in the Ninth Federal Reserve District. My name is Carmiana Matson. I am the Assistant Vice President of Regional Outreach and Public Programs at the Minneapolis Fed. I'm going to be turning it over to Ron Wirtz in a moment, but before I do, I'll let you know that this webinar is part of a series of webinars on regional economic conditions. I'll be placing links in the Zoom chat box to our upcoming webinars. We'd love for you to join us at those as well. You'll also be receiving a survey at the completion of today's webinar. We'd love to get your feedback on future webinar topics. And at the end of Ron's presentation today, we will have a few minutes for questions. We will be entertaining questions via the chat box on Zoom. So if at any point you have a question, you can type that in the chat box. Thanks so much, and I will turn it over to Ron.
Thanks, Carmi. I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate everyone attending today. The surveys that we're doing really try to get a good gauge on how business activity is right now. And I'm really happy to be here today because finally, I think I have some good news, better news than I've had with these webinars in the past. So I really want to just thank everyone for taking the time. Hopefully these messages can kind of start filtering out to the broader community as well. And hopefully things are just going to look better. Before I get started, I have to give you my disclaimer. The views here expressed are mine and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. So as Carmi mentioned, this is part of a series, the Regional Economic Conditions series. And what's happened is that with the pandemic, we've really accelerated our survey work. And what we're trying to do is it really complements some of the existing work we had been doing, but we really want to try to get a better gauge from businesses about what current economic conditions were. So we have quarterly surveys. The one that I'm going to talk about today, the general business. There's also a construction survey, hospitality and tourism, and ag credit. Those are all quarterly surveys we do to try to get a good gauge on regional economic conditions. And we also have annual surveys, manufacturing and professional services actually will be going out fairly shortly. The point is that the Minneapolis Fed is really trying to connect more with businesses across the Ninth District. And as we do, we're using these webinars to really help disseminate and discuss what businesses are trying to tell us about current conditions. We feel like if it's important for the Minneapolis Fed to know, it's important for the public, for the business community to know about that as well. So we're really kind of trying to turn the survey results around quickly so everybody learns more. First, I want to give a shout out to the partners and to my survey takers. For the survey takers out there that are listening, I really appreciate your insights. They're really valuable. We have about 60 partnering organizations for this particular survey that are across the Ninth District. Again, the Ninth District running Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and Western Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Montana. For the most part, most of our partnering organizations are chambers of commerce, economic development organizations, some government agencies, and then other business and workforce organizations that have essentially a membership or a professional network. And they help get our surveys out to members and their contact networks. I'm always looking for more partners to get surveys out to more businesses. If you happen to be watching, you happen to be part of a business organization that would be interested, you can contact me on the side, maybe leave a note in the chat box. I would be happy to follow up. So today's focus, as I mentioned, is the general business survey. We conducted this in mid-April. We got a little over 800 responses from across the Ninth District. And the good news is that we had improved geographic balance in terms of responses. We didn't get quite as many in the Twin Cities. We got more in the Dakotas and Montana and the UP. So we had a little bit better overall balance in terms of the responses. As I've reminded people in the past, for those that have watched in previous webinars, these results are a snapshot. It's not a scientifically sampled survey, so I will offer a fair number of caveats to some of the results. I would ask that you also interpret some of the results with care. So in general, what I'm going to tell you about is that Q1 revenues were not particularly upbeat. But again, as the survey has really made very clear over time, is that firm size, sector, the state you're located in, and ownership remain significant factors. Firm size in general, though, it illustrates a picture that overall growth has actually been better than what the overall results kind of look like. And I'll explain that more in a bit. But I think really the message coming out of this survey was that we're seeing improved and growing optimism really across a lot of different business measures and across virtually all subgroups. However, the but here is that there are still really significant threats, particularly related to workforce, higher input costs, and supply chain disruptions. Okay, so let's get into the survey results themselves. So recent revenue is really kind of the big thing that we're interested in, how active and how busy our business is. So the first chart here, I'll just explain a few things. So we asked businesses to give us their assessment of Q1 revenues compared to 3 different time measures. The top bar is year over year, so Q1 this year to Q1 last year. The middle bar is Q1 this year to Q4 of 2020, so October, November, December. And then we asked them to project expectations for the second quarter. And we asked them to compare second quarter this year expectations to last year's actual performance. In the chart, red means bad, green means good, deeper red means worse, if that makes sense. So if you go top to bottom, basically what you see is that Q1 revenues were not particularly upbeat on the surface in terms of all firms, actually a net negative in terms of those that saw revenue, positive revenue trends versus negative revenue trends. There are other data that suggest Q1 activity might be a little bit stronger than you see here. Q1 compared to the previous quarter starts to balance out a little bit more, mostly about a neutral response. But again, from some other viewpoints, I think that we're starting to see some added growth. And that really comes out in the expectations for the second quarter, what they expect in the coming quarter compared to last year. So as I mentioned, size really matters. It has mattered probably more than any particular metric in terms of firms, more than anything else that we ask in terms of the firm demographics. Generally speaking, larger firms have performed much better than smaller firms. Smaller firms are seeing much more negative revenue trends. So if you think about it from an overall standpoint, the fact that larger firms are growing, that means overall activity is actually growing more. Because if you have 1,000-person firm that is growing and 2 or 3 very small firms that are not, that's still net growth. It's not great for those firms, of course. But again, in thinking about it in a little bit different context, we are still seeing growth, I think, in Q1. The better news, though, is that future expectations, if you look at the chart on the right, is that second quarter expectations are up across the board, even for smaller firms. Admittedly, they're still seeing worse outcomes than larger firms, but they're seeing net positive expectations for the second quarter. And I think that's really notable. And in general, you'll kind of see this same theme play out. There are going to be some firms that are still performing more negatively than others, but their performance is going to improve in Q2, at least to their belief. So in terms of some of the geographic results, we are seeing Western District states seem to be faring better overall. I would only point out that there are some compositional effects that you need to kind of take into consideration here. So Montana had the highest share of finance respondents, and finance has very consistently outperformed other sectors. North Dakota had the biggest share of larger firms. As I've just mentioned, that's a big factor as well. The UP of Michigan had a very, very large double or triple the respondents in accommodation and food, and it had very few large firms. So that's going to have an effect there. Twin Cities, a high rate of professional technical firms, along with construction. Construction in particular, the Twin Cities has seen more of a downturn than in other places. So that is also going to have an effect. The good news, though, again, across the board, we're seeing more positive sentiment across all the states in the 9th district. So you have kind of the same stratification in terms of who believes they're going to do how well, but it's improved across the board. So we also asked firms to identify what sector they are in. And I'm not going to give you the Q1. It's essentially the similar chart as this one, just a little bit more red in it, okay? Again, roughly the same kind of stratification in terms of performance. But what you see here is that the expectation for Q2 is that it is positive across all sectors, even in entertainment, recreation, and in accommodation and food, drink. So we really do see that there's a lot more optimism. We think there's also a lot more visibility about what they can expect coming for Q2. Minority-owned firms is the last one that I'll talk about in terms of some of these firm demographics. And what you see here, again, minority firms have persistently performed or have seen more negative revenue trends, and that persists with Q1. but you really see a collapse or a compression of results as it relates to Q2. So we're really seeing more positive responses across all firms, and we're seeing something that's much more closer with regards to minority and women-owned firms. The other good news is that workforce demand really appears to be rising. Again, it's always hard to make comparisons, especially now when we're trying to compare a late pandemic period to the worst part of the pandemic being Q2, and even in Q1. So we always have to be a little bit careful about how much optimism we try to read into these things. However, all we can do is say, are you hiring or not? And what we're generally seeing is that the trend is getting very positive. Not surprisingly, current staffing is still a little bit lower compared to 12 months ago. But if you look at since 3 months ago, it's starting to even out more. We're seeing a little bit better evenness on that. Fewer that said that they are lower than 3 months ago. And especially in the coming 3 months, you really see a positive shift. Many expect to be hiring and have higher staffing levels in the next 3 months. Challenges though. So we've talked about a lot of optimism right now. Unfortunately, optimism isn't revenue. We actually have to go out and try to execute and get business. And we know that there are a lot of challenges firms are facing. That's what they told us. So despite the fact that a lot are hiring, they are hiring, but they aren't necessarily getting them in the door. So the job postings are out there. The hiring seems to be going less well. Many of them are seeing extremely or moderately difficult conditions in terms of trying to find and hire necessary labor. So especially if you need more labor because you have a lot of work, not getting that labor probably means you're not going to be able to realize some of the revenue that you otherwise might have gotten. We asked them about a number of different challenges that they likely are facing. And again, labor availability, the bar on the farthest left, comes out on top by a fair margin. But what this shows is that there are a litany of other challenges that businesses are still facing. Roughly 1 out of 10 firms that replied had one of these as a major issue, and they identified a multitude of others. So the fact that there is optimism, the fact that there does appear to be growing demand, businesses are still really facing an awful lot of challenges as it relates to supply chain disruptions, operating restrictions that are still in places. You still have the inconvenience of COVID, you have quarantines that are still relevant, childcare, and other things that firms are really trying to be able to figure out while trying to actually grow and realize those higher revenues. Wages. This has been I think, as I talk to businesses, this seems to be a growing concern, or maybe not even a concern, an issue that I hear more and more about. The perception seems to be that wages are rising very steeply. And I think wages are rising, that's accurate. But it seems to be that the perception may be getting ahead of what at least firms are telling us from an answer standpoint. Roughly 80% of firms rose wages by less than 3%, 3% being a really rough kind of historical marker of average wage growth. And that would be, frankly, not necessarily illustrative of recent times, say the last 10 years. Historically, we look at over 3% as something that is a little bit stronger than average. And so we are definitely seeing wage growth. What I would say is we're not seeing exceptionally strong wage growth right now. It is expected to modestly grow over the coming year. Again, not something that I think would suggest overly strong wage growth. The other thing that really came out very strongly in this survey is prices. We are hearing from firms really in all sectors that they are seeing non-labor input prices. That would be the bottom chart. We're hearing that it's just more expensive to do business. You do have COVID-related things, practices that are increasing costs to businesses. You also have material costs that we know are rising. And it does appear that actually a lot of these increases are flowing through to final customers. So the top chart is basically our firms increasing their prices to their final customer the retail price, and the suggestion here is yes, and it looks like we're seeing stronger increases on both levels than we've seen in previous surveys. But I wouldn't want to leave you without a more, kind of a positive vibe, because the outlook really is strong from what businesses are telling us. So we always we're asking an outlook for the coming 6 months, and it really is very positive overall. We went generally, again, I would caution, too many comparisons from survey to survey, but I'm going to do a little bit of that and just offer the necessary caveats. From a rough assessment, we went from a net negative in October without really worrying exactly what the percentages were, but it was a net negative in October to a roughly net neutral or cautious January, where we really started to hear that they were looking, that they could kind of see some light at the end of the tunnel, or at least more optimism. And this is an exceptionally strong net positive outlook in April. You essentially have roughly 3/4 or so, 2/3 actually, that are positive, and only a little less than 20% that are pessimist. So on a net standpoint, you really have a very positive outlook right here. The one area too that I think really kind of demonstrates this is I took a look at the accommodations and food sector and what their short-term outlook is here. And you go from the October to January and April, and without getting into too much about the actual, the fine-tooth numbers, generally you can see a very clear uptick in optimism. And I also would point out that here you also see very few that are neutral or that they don't know. And that to me is probably a nice signal that they have a little bit more clarity and visibility about what to expect going forward. I think in the pandemic, one of the real problems was that things were very volatile and conditions could change very quickly. I think hopefully we're on a little bit more solid ground in terms of the economy moving forward, and that seems to be reflected in this survey. So my quick takeaways. So again, the Q1 revenues, not particularly great, but I think there is overall growth if you kind of take a little bit look a little bit deeper than just the overall response. Again, larger firms are seeing growth, so I think overall economic activity, we are seeing growth, and hopefully we'll be able to see stronger growth among small firms as we go forward. But we do see that small firms, minority-owned firms, accommodation, food, entertainment, all of those, there are firms that are still seeing worse revenue trends, and those are things that we're really still paying a lot of attention to. The good news here, I think, is the Q2 expectations are higher across the board, including really good improvements for those that have been hit the hardest. So hopefully those that have been hit the hardest can start to see that recovery, hopefully a little bit quicker than we might otherwise see. Unfortunately, realizing the growth potential is harder than just being an optimistic person. Labor availability, rising input prices, supply chain disruptions, and you got to remember that there's still this COVID thing that is out there. Until we have an even better handle on things, once the vaccines are maybe a little bit more widespread, I think COVID is still going to be an issue in terms of how the economy performs going forward. So we hope that the influence there only goes less. Overall, I think the best way to assess it is it's way better than the road we just got off of, or everything that's in the rearview mirror. So my hope is that this is just the first of many positive surveys and survey results that the Minneapolis Fed is able to bring to everyone listening out there. I appreciate the opportunity to present these results, and I just wanted to note too, this is part of a larger survey series, and we are still doing a lot of tracking. I have some upcoming surveys in hospitality and tourism, and I do that only in Minnesota, and that's coming up in mid-May. And then I have a construction survey as well, and that's also in mid-May. So again, our intent is to really try to keep a pulse on businesses in the 9th District, and when we do, we want to bring that information to you so you have better information as well. That is the end of my formal remarks. I would love to have or be able to take questions for as long as you have questions.
Thanks, Ron. If folks have questions, you can submit those in the chat box on Zoom. Before we get to those, I will let everyone know that you will be receiving a copy of Ron's slides as well as a copy of the video of this webinar in your email next week. So, Ron, you've talked a lot about the optimism that we're seeing in this survey. You've not mentioned what's driving this optimism. Do you have any insights
Right.
into that?
Right. Very good question. Thank you for that. I think much of it is probably, I think what everyone probably realizes just the fact that we do have better control of the virus. I think some of the stimulus packages that have been passed have kept businesses afloat, have helped households with their own budgets. So I think those two things are clearly happening. I think also there's just pent up demand as people and businesses are seeing as we get to the other end of the pandemic. I think there, and what I've heard from retail contacts and others, is that they really feel like there's some pent up demand that's out there. And that's really what's driving a lot of the optimism, I think.
Can you talk a little bit about labor availability? And you showed us some stats that businesses are really looking for folks, and yet we're hearing that folks are unemployed out there as well. So what's driving the disconnect? What role do maybe enhanced unemployment benefits play in that?
Right. We do hear a lot about the enhanced unemployment benefits, and we do know that it's having some influence. What effect it's having on a real kind of concrete way is really hard to know. It's something that we're actually doing a lot more research on, not only with firms, but also with workforce. Real quickly, we do ask firms what they believe some of the labor availability issues are related to, and invariably they tend to identify two things: the enhanced unemployment benefit and the work ethic of the people that are not working. Again, I think that's a much deeper question to get into, but we are also doing a lot more effort to talk to the workforce portion itself, particularly those that are not working. And we're trying to better understand what labor force participation means, why people are and are not working. And what we're learning is that it's a really complicated matter. While I think unemployment benefits are having a role here, I think the fact that you still have an environment where you may be dealing with virtual school, or at least the threat of, you also have issues like daycare, child care issues, and affordability and access. You may have still a lot of fear out there that we hear from contacts in the workforce development space of workers that are fearful of COVID, and not necessarily even fearful for them, but as we've actually heard a number of anecdotes related to younger workers being very nervous about bringing that into a home, maybe if they're living with grandparents or older parents, that I think the fear of COVID, I think, still is out there. And I think it's a legitimate concern for some. So we know it's a very complicated issue and something that we're really spending a lot of time to try to learn more about, because I think going forward, labor force participation is going to be absolutely critical to recovery. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than it looks like maybe on the surface. I think when enhanced unemployment benefits expire, I would expect some rebound in participation. But if you go back to pre-pandemic, we were at a labor participation deficit there too, even before the pandemic. So I don't expect things to all of a sudden get immensely better when the enhanced unemployment benefits expire.
And are you hearing anything about lack of remote work productivity? Is that having an impact for anyone?
Right. We actually asked the question regarding remote work, and some employers are seeing it as an issue. I think part of it is in some cases it can be harder to track productivity, at least as you are used to kind of tracking it from a firm standpoint. So it's hard. I would say there's actually two sides to that coin. I think some remote, maybe the newness has fallen off, and some of the difficulties that you have maybe with corporate culture or other things that going to the office really help productivity. Some of those things are maybe starting to come through a little bit more. I do think we've also heard plenty of anecdotes that I think firms are seeing that people can work remotely and work effectively remotely. Some businesses, though, you have to be in the office. If you're working at a restaurant, there's no such thing as remote work. So I think there's going to be a shift, I think, a little bit in that office model, and it's probably going to reveal itself only over time. The other thing I would say, though, from a labor force participation, what we are hearing very consistently is that many workers who are looking for remote options because it might work better if you have to stay home with a child or other reasons that you are interested in working, but you have a home circumstance that doesn't allow you necessarily to take a 9 to 5 job or to commute 20 miles to a job that is there if you have other things that have to be taken care of at home.
So, a question about access to credit. Is that something you ask about? Are firms finding it harder or easier to get the credit they need?
We don't ask about that. We don't hear about that as a strong issue. We heard about it more with when the PPP loans were, high visibility. We were hearing that more small firms were not getting access to that. I think the subsequent PPP programs are doing a better job of getting financing into firms that need it. But we also know that there are still circumstances, particularly if you are unbanked or if you don't have strong bank relations, I think their access to credit for small firms probably is still an issue. We don't happen to ask about it in this survey.
What about downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul specifically? There's a questioner saying, those remain relatively unopen compared to other parts of the district. Mm-hmm. What are you hearing about those areas and the impact that's having?
Well, I don't think there's any question there has been impact. I think if you were to talk to the restaurant industry and the hotel industry in both of those downtowns, they are looking for things to improve. I think until businesses decide that they are going to bring their workers back, I think there's going to be a lot of jostling in the office space environment. The good news for building owners is that, most of them, those leases are long. So I think some of that transition might be a little bit more slow. But in the meantime, there still are a lot of workers from downtown that are working remotely. And I think, we'll know more as we start to see more foot traffic from those big office buildings, because that really is what's driving a lot of the economy downtown. And right now, a lot of them are still, I don't want to say displaced, but they're working from home. So that money is getting spent in different places now.
Let's shift gears a little bit. There's a question about supply chain disruptions. Do we have any expectations that those will improve and alleviate some of the near-term pressures?
Well, we would certainly hope so. The one beauty of private industry is they are terribly resourceful. So where there are problems, they are good. They tend to be good problem solvers. The problem here is that there are lots of challenges to supply chain management, with regards to closed borders, with varying COVID infection rates in other countries that might be influencing production. Even here, just the limitations you have when you can't find drivers for materials. All of those things are problems, and we are hearing a lot about that. My expectation is that things will improve. I think the more we have COVID under control, you have fewer quarantines, things of that nature. I think we're going to see those kind of repair themselves. We don't know how fast, though. That's the problem.
And we have time for one last question. Does the Fed track the volume of new small businesses that are forming as a result of the pandemic?
Right. Yes and no. We are tracking some of that. It's hard. Some of the new data, it's hard to know exactly what we call a new business. I mean, we do have some measures, and we are tracking, new incorporations, things like that. You saw a really big spike in the summer when the PPP loan was came out, and in general, after the second quarter, saw such a steep drop. We did start seeing a lot of activity in terms of the things businesses do to incorporate. But we're not sure exactly how much that's going to fall out. People may have kind of started, kind of put out a shingle or started a business out of their truck. In the interim, we don't know how much that's going to hold going forward. And only through the process of time are we going to see really just how much new entrepreneurism we're going to see from that kind of that shock that was the pandemic, the deepest part of the pandemic.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks everyone for joining us. We will be emailing a copy of Ron's slides and a video of this presentation to you next week, and we'd love to see you at our upcoming webinars. I placed links to those in the Zoom chat box. We're featuring the health of the Minnesota childcare sector next week, and the following week, the agricultural credit conditions survey. Before you exit, we'd love for you to complete the feedback survey that you get as you leave the Zoom room. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.